writing instruction advanced slowly in the post-war period in the Anglophone. The need for scholarship addressing the writing deficits of underprepared post-secondary learners led to a dramatic increase in the research and the teaching of writing at the post-secondary level. These innovations have led to the establishment of the theory-based and professional institutions of a distinct academic discipline called rhetoric and composition. Because of this history, rhetoric and composition's intellectual home base in the past several decades has been institutions in the United States. In the decades since achieving their independence from Britain, understandable concerns about Americanization of their culture and educational systems have made many Anglophone Caribbean nations prefer at times to look to the UK for guidance in terms of pedagogy. Nonetheless, the significant difficulties that many Caribbean student writers face in composing in standard English have led Caribbean post-secondary institutions to teach American-style college writing courses with the goal of improving the perceived deficits in their student writing, often using textbooks written for the American college composition market. However, despite routinely looking to the American tradition of rhetoric and composition for guidance, many college composition programs in the Anglophone Caribbean have continued using traditional pedagogical models that have long since been replaced and are challenged by the American tradition of rhetoric and composition. That is to say, Caribbean post-secondary institutions have taught college composition classes without an extensive rhetoric and composition knowledge base. Consistent with an emphasis on product over process, many post-secondary institutions in the Anglophone Caribbean have traditionally placed greater institutional weight on the rhetoric of excellence rather than social equity and ease of access, a rhetoric which manifests itself as grading standards which can seem punitive to non-Caribbean faculty. Hand in hand with the rhetoric of excellence rather than equity has been the maintenance of what may appear to outsiders as traditional attitudes to standard and non-standard Englishes. These conservative attitudes are likely to strike outsiders as surprising, especially because the home languages of the majority of the population in most Anglophone Caribbean nations are English Creoles. The unique phonological features of Caribbean Creoles do for certain manifest themselves frequently in Caribbean post-secondary students' writing as errors in standard English expression. My favorite being several tourists from consonant cluster simplification rather than several tourists. Nonetheless, most of the errors in Caribbean post-secondary students' writing cannot be directly attributed to the interference of their home languages. Instead, many, if not most, of the errors in Caribbean first-year post-secondary students' writing are comparable to well-established patterns found in basic writing, that is, writing produced by underprepared post-secondary writers. For example, the use of informal personal language in formal writing, and the use of evidence and discourse conventions inappropriate for academic registers. Perhaps more important in determining the formal written output of Anglophone Caribbean students than the direct influence of linguistic structures of their home languages are the orally focused cultures of Anglophone Caribbean nations. Cultures that often lead students to enter post-secondary learning environments with limited experience writing in formal standard English and limited knowledge of the conventions of academic writing, despite the fact that standard English is the de jure language of instruction from primary school on. And then my final section is from a section from my chapter in the book. This section is called A Productive Synthesis, Embracing the Oral in the Caribbean Composition Classroom. Without fail, in every college composition, I should say every face-to-face college composition course I teach at the University of Bahamas, the same illuminating moment occurs. On the first day of class, after having spent some 45 minutes overviewing the syllabus and my expectations for the class using a traditional didactic lecture style, I then ask the students to introduce herself/himself to the student next to herself/himself, so that the second student can introduce the original student, hopefully previously unknown to them, to the class as a whole. Immediately, the students' glum and sober faces, unchanged since the beginning of class, and undoubtedly expecting the same lecture style to continue, change to smiles, their eyes brightening as they begin to converse. That is to say, my students respond positively to this simple display of respect to them as thinking individuals, putting their cultural oral proclivities to use, beginning a dialogue rather than what must seem a droning, inculcating monologue. Surprisingly, this simple turn of classroom discourse structure and classroom authority changes the mood and tone of the class until the end of the period, the positive mood seemingly remaining in the classroom for the next several sessions. I believe that the above simple anecdote is symbolic of a larger cultural proclivity waiting to be harnessed by Caribbean university writing instructors. In other words, an effective way to engage Bahamian and other Caribbean students in the university writing classroom is through harnessing their cultural taste for oratory and orality. This is not, however, to essentialize or suggest that all Anglophone Caribbean students are better at oral conversation than at written compositions. Many Anglophone Caribbean students are much better at written communication. Indeed, it is often striking how wide the gap between students' communicative efficacy in one medium versus the other may be. Given this cultural proclivity and given the didactic sit down, shut up pedagogical style that often dominates from the primary up to the post-secondary level, I have found students to be quite receptive to assignments and tasks where they can engage in dialogue and oratorical performance rather than be silenced and alienated by a didactic monologue. Accordingly, I routinely design classroom activities that involve small or large group discussions and or oral presentations, with students becoming active participants in the classroom discourse. For instance, I often have students make individual and group oral presentations, both as independent assignments and as scaffolding assignments for the major papers, with the goal of both improving students' oratorical abilities and helping them build their ideas for their written assignments. For example, in UV's 300 level English composition class with a focus on disciplinary modes of writing and discourse, I routinely break up students into groups based on their fields of study, with each group producing an oral presentation critically analyzing the features of one or more salient genres of writing in their field of study. For example, the research article for science majors and corporate annual reports for business majors. After the group oral presentation, students then draw upon the arguments and points of analysis that they originally developed for the group oral presentation, honing their portion of the oral presentation into a developed, focused genre analysis essay on an important genre of writing used in their field of study. I also use classroom debates as a teaching strategy in my composition classrooms. Specifically, I break up students into two groups, one for and one against a proposition, then give them time to strategize the arguments they will make, ways they will attempt to refute the opposing side's counter arguments. The debate proper begins with a nominated speaker from each side presenting both their group's arguments and their arguments for their proposition, as well as their arguments against the opposing proposition. After each group's appointed speaker has made their initial case, the debate becomes a more unstructured point-counterpoint in which any member of the class can participate. Inevitably, the discussion at this point becomes raucous, but nonetheless quite productive. After the debate is complete, I end the day's session with a metacritical discussion of the argumentative techniques that the students used during the oral debate, listing the various arguments as well as the strategies the students used to make each argument on the board, with the goal that the students could draw upon these strategies in their written compositions. Finally, although composing in written standard English is for certain an important skill for Bahamian and other Caribbean college and university students to master, and is indeed a skill toward which I focus the majority of my efforts in my composition classes, it is arguable that Caribbean young adults and future Caribbean professionals are more likely to affect important change in their countries through participation in dialogue and in oratory rather than through writing. Indeed, if the reason the American composition tradition is focused so heavily on building students' written skills is to empower them during their college life in the workforce and the marketplace of ideas, in the Caribbean, the same could be emphasized with orality, with students' oral efficacy playing an arguably greater role in determining their communicative prowess. In a word, writing instructors working in the Caribbean should unabashedly embrace the oral and the oratorical in their classrooms. Thank you very much. I now pass on to Dr. Milson White.
I need the host. Okay, thank you. Okay, Madam Chair, thank you for your introduction and congratulatory note. And thank you, Dr. Owenbring, for starting us off on our theme, academic writing in the Caribbean, searching for a Caribbean identity. Ladies and gentlemen, both Dr. Searsing and Dr. Owenbring have ably recognized all guests, and so I greet wholeheartedly all of you, including the family of the late Mrs. Anatole Rogers and the organizers of this memorial lecture. I am deeply honored to have been invited to share in this lecture that is used annually to mark Mrs. Rogers' contributions to the development of Bahamian society. Like the current Vice President of the United States of America, whose father is Jamaican, Mrs. Rogers was a history maker. And while we await the post-election accomplishments of Vice President Kamala Harris, especially as they might resonate with the Caribbean, we know that in the audience are testaments to Mrs. Rogers' achievements. As the first female Bahamian principal of the then government high school, Mrs. Rogers helped to nurture and ensure the academic and social development of significant numbers of Bahamian adolescents. Many of you in the audience this evening are familiar with those politicians and other professionals who would have won places to government high school and who continue to contribute to the development of the Bahamian chain of islands and by extension, the Caribbean region and beyond. As an educator, Mrs. Rogers would have been interested in the research and writing of individuals like Dr. Owenbring and I. Along with Dr. Brian Jacquet and the contributors of individual chapters in Creole composition, academic writing, and rhetoric in the Anglophone Caribbean, we have produced a first of its kind in the region, a book suggesting frameworks around which to build and further institutionalize and professionalize writing studies in the region. Through this book, we have contributed to a conversation about the academic writing education of students in post-secondary institutions in the Caribbean and of students of Caribbean origin in other places, such as the United States of America. And as you have heard, with this book, the Caribbean marks another first in terms of its selection for the Modern Language Association of America's award of the 36th Mina P. Shaughnessy Prize. Mina Shaughnessy, a widely respected teacher scholar of writing studies, and Mrs. Anatole Rogers, a great Bahamian educator, make for good company. Out of the confluence of the manifestations of solid contributions to education and the development of human resources that we speak of this evening, I would like us to understand that we are still on a quest to chart Caribbean identity, to self-define in terms of academic writing or advanced written literacy. In an era of increasing access to higher education by previously excluded segments in each Caribbean country, the collection Creole Composition presents important work being done in the Bahamas and across the Caribbean to provide a sense of the identity of the students, instructors, and our body of work. Important as all of these contributions are, however, as the book says, the collection is but part of the start of discussions on what would constitute effective praxis regarding Anglophone Caribbean students' academic writing development. Indeed, there is still much research to be done regarding the development of Caribbean students' academic literacies, and I will be sharing with us why we need to continue the conversation, to expand the literature. In short, why we need to establish through research the mythos and ethos of teaching academic writing in the Caribbean context. To do this, I turn to the late Rex Nettlefield. In Inward Stretch, Outward Reach, A Voice from the Caribbean, noted Caribbean scholar and dancer Rex Nettlefield wrote that those who can see a brighter future after experiences of pain or suffering or oppression demonstrate survival that is a function of a people's capacity for inward stretch and outward reach, the cause, occasion, and result of a certain life tension that is potentially creative even while it threatens to be destructively disintegrative. He encouraged Caribbean peoples to go beyond survival, writing that if much of the past was endured on the basis of inward stretch, the future must expand on this, extending and sustaining ideal, form, and purpose for the region by outward reach. I am borrowing Nettlefield's image this evening, stretching inward, reaching outward, as imperatives for facilitators of students' academic writing development in post-secondary institutions and for facilitators of language and literacy development at the secondary level in the Anglophone Caribbean. And I will reference the contributors to the book, Creole Composition. We need to dig deep and reach out for various reasons, and I'll be sharing just 4 of these this evening. The first is to present accurate profiles of our students. Who are the students who people our academic writing programs in the Bahamas and elsewhere in the Caribbean? Let's use as example the case of Jamaica. In my 2015 book, Academic Writing Instruction for Creole-Influenced Students, I indicate that to an outsider, Jamaicans' linguistic behaviors can appear enigmatic. Some Jamaicans are English-only speakers who understand Creole. Some are English-dominant bilinguals. Some are Creole-dominant bilinguals. Some may be equally bilingual in Creole and English. Some are Creole-only speakers who may or may not understand English. Some slide between the shifting poles in ways yet to be named. Some do not acknowledge their linguistic profiles and behaviors, but all encounter Jamaican Creole. Since all Jamaicans are influenced in one way or another by the Creole, but are not all Creole speaking, I refer to Jamaican students as Creole-influenced students. And by Creole, I'm referring to what is called patois in Jamaica, but that linguists refer to as Jamaican Creole, one of the several English lexified Creoles in the Caribbean. The description of the situation in Jamaica might seem fairly easy to comprehend, I hope, but when we turn to the Bahamas with English and Bahamian Creole, also called Bahamian dialect, Bahamianese dialect, and so on, we must then consider segments of the population for whom French or Haitian Creole is significant. And I will allow us to imagine the diversity that could manifest in English composition and other classes at the University of the Bahamas, even if students attempt or manage to conceal aspects of their linguistic repertoires by the time they reach the university. In Mrs. Rogers' time, entry into government high school by ordinary Bahamians who were not of the white mercantile class was based on excellent performance in primary level examinations. The meritocratic system that obtained then would have led to a kind of linguistic homogeneity in classrooms because the brightest and best in just about any system would also have mastered the language of instruction and been readied to surmount challenges attending advanced written literacy. With increasing possibilities for movement through both legal migration and illegal travel, and the democratization of education that prevails today in many parts of the globe, there are significant expansions in cohorts and attendant increasing linguistic diversity in classrooms. But what are Caribbean students like beyond their linguistic profiles or even their peculiar engagements with time, like arriving on island time for classes and leaving early, as experienced by Shanti Bruce, an American professor, who in a 2015 publication reflected on flying into the Bahamas to teach classes over 2-day periods for Nova Southeastern University. What do we know about the transition from high school or secondary level to university in the Bahamas and the rest of the Caribbean? How prepared are students for the academic writing instruction they will receive in post-secondary contexts? What is the link between the Bahamas General Certificate of Secondary Education, the BGCSE, or other local or regional examination results and students' academic writing performance in post-secondary institutions like the University of the Bahamas? Annual results of Bahamian examinations may present a grim picture of students writing at the secondary level. And we do have a few studies that tell us of weaknesses in other Caribbean students' writing. But we need follow-up studies to plumb students' challenges. Which aspects of academic writing do Bahamian students, for example, find most challenging? Which genres of writing present most difficulty for which groups of Caribbean students? In Creole composition, we see that Melissa Allain of the Open Campus of the University of the West Indies, the UWI, located in Barbados, has begun to examine how Caribbean students' feelings and attitudes affect academic writing performance. And Christine Kozikowski from the University of the Bahamas has examined how culture concerning attitudes to time can affect how much is accomplished in a teaching session. So another question is, what body of knowledge do we have to enable us to make comparisons between the attitudes and academic writing of differing cohorts of students in and from the Anglophone Caribbean? In general, we need statistics to engage with stakeholders as we make claims for our teaching and request changes to support certain students' academic writing development based on the profiles of them that we are presenting. The second reason I'm suggesting we should be digging deep is to show that we are doing more than teaching and more than teaching English grammar. Teaching pedagogies are informed by theory, by research. So where is our body of writing reflecting the teaching pedagogies to which we subscribe, reflecting the research paradigms that inform our investigations into advanced written literacy in the Caribbean? What are our ways of writing and why did we experience such shifts? When did we, if we did, shift from a heavy English grammar emphasis to engage with, for example, process approaches to writing? Why are changes made when they are made in academic writing education and with what results in Caribbean post-secondary institutions? Contributors Beverly Josephs and Clover Jones Mackenzie, as well as Deidre Smith and Michelle Stewart McCoy, have started to contemplate pedagogical changes in one university in Jamaica. But we have to work our research muscles a little more. Have we been engaging with writing about writing as proposed by Douglas Downs and Elizabeth Wardle in the US? What is our take on transfer of learning? This is a sensitive, controversial subject, as Kathleen Yancey and her colleagues reminded in 2019. But what do we know about transfer of knowledge and skills from academic writing courses to other courses in Caribbean institutions? Does it happen? How? To what extent? Why do professors, lecturers in other courses sometimes contact an academic writing facilitator to ask, did this or that student really pass the English composition or academic writing course that you teach? What is our connection to new research into language, things like code meshing and translingualism? Code meshing involves blending elements of different languages to create meaning in writing. And translingualism involves negotiating in and across languages in specific instances of communication instead of relying on predefined rules to determine meaning. Things we do daily in speech in the Caribbean that some of us do not think should be done in formal settings, but that scholars elsewhere are attempting to formalize. What we might call the language question in the supposedly English-speaking Caribbean is unsettled because of uncertainties regarding English and the English Creoles, as well as because of internal and interregional migration that has led to not insignificant representations of other languages and varieties in some of our countries. These developments require posture like that of contributor Kendra Mitchell of coming to terms with the diversity in our academic writing classrooms. What's the result likely to be if we engage with the suggestion of contributor Heather M. Robinson to take a truly post-colonial perspective in our teaching of academic writing? This approach involves allowing students to, as she says, incorporate a plural post-colonial subject position into what they write, so as to bring together the many facets of the linguistic identities which, in a colonial space, are often split by force. Contemplation of scholarship regarding treatment of linguistic diversity in the teaching of writing elsewhere might help us in the Caribbean to address issues of language in ways that would minimize the linguistic trauma many students have experienced in Caribbean educational systems and that Carmenita Jones and Jacob Dyer-Spiegel describe in Creole Composition. Of course, we have a huge challenge that traverses the various educational levels in that many different strategies and areas of focus are conflated. Language, English, writing, writing in a first language, writing in a second language, all different entities and elements, all of which are of relevance to the Caribbean, often, unfortunately, get lumped as English, and teaching gets reduced to teaching English grammar. However, I am suggesting that where there is still heavy emphasis on teaching English grammar, can we also focus our concerns on style, perhaps seeing it as culturally structured intuition as proposed by Keith Rhodes in 2019, and he's a US lawyer and scholar of writing. If we join the inquiry into style, we can help to determine if, as Rhodes proposes, style flows from the writer's intuitive intentions more than from any other influence, including any specific methods that we teach. Because of our region's linguistic and other experiences, we have much to contribute to academic conversations about language. We can also contribute to conversations about transnational composition. We have been engaging in this for decades in the Caribbean. Think of the UWI, starting as the UCWI, a college of the University of London, or think offshore universities. What have we to say about them and advanced written literacy instruction for Caribbean students? Shanti Bruce has given the perspective from the North American end, but what is ours? What is the experience like in the Caribbean, where Caribbean institutions set up franchises in other countries in the region with arrangements for local facilitators to teach their academic writing courses? Or what's the experience with the satellites of the University of the Bahamas that are set up away from Nassau? Whatever we engage with in our various institutions across the region, it is our research that can and will show to what end we engage and with what levels of success. And it is through dissemination of our research findings that we will be able to contribute to the broader field of writing studies. The third reason is that research about academic writing in the Anglophone Caribbean could lead to better articulation of writing in individual countries and across the region. What are similarities and differences in teaching and assessing writing in the various post-secondary institutions in any one Caribbean country, across universities and other post-secondary institutions? Contributors Anif Campbell, as well as Deidre Smith and Michelle Stewart McCoy, have started to address issues related to assessment of writing in their various institutions in Jamaica. In other publications, Dr. Owen Bring and his colleagues have been sharing their research regarding academic writing in the Bahamas. But how do their findings compare to occurrences elsewhere? What's the situation in other institutions in these and other islands? We need studies to help to show that our assessment of writing is consistent and grounded in theories of assessment in the local context and so on. And with regard to teacher response to student writing specifically, what are our response modes? How do students respond to teacher or tutor feedback? How do we know that our laboring in grading and providing other forms of feedback on student papers is worth the effort? What's the impact of the digital age on our work, on teaching, on how we teach revision of writing, on our response to student writing, on assessing writing? In 2020, the regional examining body, the Caribbean Examinations Council, CXC, like other institutions in the region, had to make some adjustments to its assessment procedures. As some of us can recall, that body had to field many questions from representatives of ministries of education in multiple countries, as teachers and students were concerned about some of the results released in summer 2020. CXC even responded to some requests by doing a review of the 2020 assessment, with some papers being remarked. And as many of you know, in the Bahamas, there were challenges attending proctoring the BGCSE in 2020, and few students and parents were happy when the results of the examinations were disseminated. Of course, these developments indicate the very serious issue of how prepared we are to respond to emergencies, to alter writing assignments and assessments at short notice, and when we know that situations like a pandemic can magnify already existing inequities. Whether in normal or new normal times, we need research results to support a solid record of excellent teaching and valid and reliable assessment within and across Caribbean institutions and countries. The fourth and final reason I'll share is that digging deep can contribute to professionalizing our work. Admittedly, researching about students' academic writing in the Anglophone Caribbean can mean painful inward stretching because of what Creole composition presents as grim descriptions of the material conditions. But we need research addressing labor and working conditions too. What does it mean to teach academic and professional literacies in the Bahamas, in the various English-speaking Caribbean institutional contexts? What are the joys and pains of the labor? How are the academic writing programs in the Caribbean staffed? And what is the situation regarding contingent faculty? Is there any impact on outcomes? Are writing centers or resource rooms a feature of Caribbean post-secondary academic writing programs? Where are our guides for first-year writing that would show what we value in writing? While guides for writing courses are available in some institutions like the University of the Bahamas, in others there is a reliance on external texts. This kind of outward reaching could be augmented by some inward stretching, and responses to the questions above could propel our programs forward as well as augment the discipline of writing studies. So what types of studies are needed? Various kinds seem necessary. We need longitudinal studies, slow research, but we also need some fast action research. Perhaps needed are colleagues who will engage in and/or support studies involving both big data and little data. We are yet to know what exactly are the connections between reading and writing in the Anglophone Caribbean, where many students do not develop literacy in their first language, which is often an English lexified Creole. What's the situation for students of Haitian Creole background in the Bahamas who hop across more languages or language varieties to get to the Bahamian English language or composition classroom? In such instances in which Creole-influenced students do not develop by literacy and cognitive development is necessarily truncated, How do we facilitate students' development of critical thinking, itself dependent on cognitive maturity? Are the methods we are using today effective? And how do we test students' critical thinking skills today? So far in the Anglophone Caribbean, governments have not been convinced to engage in mother tongue education or in bilingual or biliterate programs at the primary level, despite statements from the United Nations and from linguists emphasizing the value of developing literacy in one's first language. Perhaps we need a longitudinal study regarding what's been happening in Haiti and Curacao, in those areas in which elementary level instruction occurs in Haitian Creole and in Papiamento respectively, and how students in those projects fare at the post-secondary level. In 2019 to 2020, a bilingual biliterate intervention project was conducted at the UMONA. It involved teaching writing laboratory sessions in Jamaican Creole and English in one semester of a year-long writing course for students who do not qualify for the regular first-year academic writing courses. Students wrote out their thoughts in Jamaican Creole or however the thoughts arose, and then with the tutor's assistance, converted these to English. Students wrote in I-dialect Creole because there was insufficient time to teach them the Cassidy-LePage orthography simultaneous with meeting course deadlines. The principal investigator, Shirelan Dean, is still in the process of analyzing the data, but has indicated some interesting preliminary findings. Students wrote powerful, heartfelt, almost tear-jerking reflections about how safe and comfortable they felt because of the opportunities afforded them to speak and write in a language in which they were comfortable. Students felt they had learned a lot, with one in science and technology reporting that one of his professors had commented on the notable positive change in his writing. Students felt the teaching approach would be valuable for other students and asked why it was not used earlier in their schooling. Of course, we anticipate the full findings from this study and hope that they will help with achieving better outcomes for students, especially those most removed from the kinds of reading and writing demanded in university studies, but for whom the need to address the affective domain may be most critical. I am also suggesting, in terms of studies we need, that consideration be given to how we may engage more with classical rhetorical notions. Dr. Owenbring has suggested seeing the Caribbean archipelago as a Greek polis, a political entity ruled by its body of citizens than by one identified ruler or monarch. And Kevin Brown, a former speaker in this lecture series, has presented the Caribbean carnivalesque through a rhetorical lens. Brown has written, the Caribbean carnivalesque as an exemplary practice has the potential for activating consciousness among historically dispossessed people, thus enabling the desires of individuals to take form through collective practice. Their work is but a start, indicating how, if we contemplate rhetorical notions a little more and appreciate Caribbean selfhood a little more, we may privilege regional practices such as our penchant for orality and collective celebrations and give a voice to those more marginalized than others in Caribbean space, as contributor Jacob Dyer-Spiegel tried to do in his teaching of academic writing in the Bahamas. So how do we proceed with the research? Creole composition indicates, our suggestion is that colleagues inside and outside the Caribbean pattern Hamilton in Miranda's musical and write everything down. Document reflections, plumb teaching situations, investigate new and old practices or strategies as a way not only to claim and ascribe agency in Caribbean national context, but also to continue to participate in broadening international discussions regarding rhetoric and composition or writing studies. Although Caribbean societies are largely oral, as writing researcher Charles Bazerman asserts, it is by writing that we inscribe our place in the literate world and all the social systems that depend on literacy. Our inscriptions in the Caribbean can help the newcomer, as Dr. Owenbring was in 2009, to see beyond the shame, stigma, avoidance, and rigor that are usually immediately apparent regarding language and the teaching of writing in the Caribbean. Creole composition also acknowledges that the kind of consistent engagement with research that we envision is no small order. Teaching loads are heavy in Caribbean institutions, and course or program coordinators do not get adequate release time for the demands of course or program administration. Despite these challenges, I'm suggesting research will help with professionalizing and with the recognition of writing program administration work as scholarship in the Caribbean. One might say research and professional organization, chicken and egg situation. However, we need a body of scholarly work in writing studies to bolster any professional organization of the kind suggested by Valerie Comby and Clover Jones Mackenzie and Tressica Campbell Dawes in the collection. Calling on scholarship on writing program administration in light of empirical evidence for the work course and program leaders do in our sphere could see changes in administrators and colleagues' understanding of our labels, labels as outlined by Tyrone Alley and other contributors to Creole composition. With the rapid proliferation of information in our globalized knowledge economies, and with anecdotal evidence that students read and write in peculiar ways in this millennium, there is urgency with which research into academic writing in the Caribbean needs to grow, and it might serve us well to make connections with our colleagues engaged in students' academic writing development or development of what they call university literacies in the Spanish and French-speaking Caribbean. Establishing such connections means we should proceed with a caution from Antonio Benitez Rojo, who has learned from the efforts of multiple Caribbean theorists that every intellectual venture directed toward investigating Caribbeanness is to become an unending search. It doesn't matter where you've left from, it doesn't matter where you've gone, it doesn't matter which ideology you profess. Caribbeanness will always remain beyond the horizon. Nettleford, however, has reminded us, in the face of this elusive Caribbeanness, that in typical Caribbean fashion, dialectical impulses are upon us, and the hope in despair that informs our day-to-day living is probably our way of asserting some kind of faith in the future. In my attempt to plumb what Nettleford presented as creative tension in Caribbean experiences, I have spent some time digging into our archives, reading other attempts at documenting our work in teaching composition or academic writing in the Caribbean, simultaneous with intervening in conversations in the US regarding language. And Dr. Owenbring has been contributing to augmenting the scholarship on post-secondary writing instruction in the Caribbean. As I pointed out gaps that remain, I trust you saw them as areas needing investigation, that you are seeing that our region is teeming with opportunities for research regarding written literacy. Continuing research is dependent on many variables. One of these is funding. I trust that the award of what is dubbed the Shaughnessy by US academics in composition to a book with significant contribution from professors at the University of the Bahamas and various other universities in the Caribbean will be encouragement for potential donors. In a word, everyone can purchase Creole composition via the Parlor Press site, Amazon.com, and other reputable online book merchants so that publishers will want to continue to publish research from the Caribbean. But to get publishable materials at the University of the Bahamas and in other Caribbean universities, we certainly need the support of alumni and other potential donors, individuals like Mrs. Rogers' offspring, to help us to continue researching. Ultimately then, operating in spaces in the Caribbean, where, as Derek Walcott said, the sea is history, and Kamal Brathwaite said, the unity is submarine. I encourage us to dance academically, to keep stretching, reaching inward, outward, to deepen and expand our engagements in researching, theorizing about and teaching academic writing in the Caribbean, to students of Caribbean origin, so that, like Mrs. Anatole Rogers, we may make positive contributions in the Bahamas and elsewhere in the Caribbean. Specifically for us, we may bring a Caribbean sensibility to writing studies by foregrounding what may be uniquely Caribbean with regard to academic writing. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for these two rousing, provocative, and engaging presentations. Now, I'm sure that there are lots of questions. And so we do have a Q&A, which is going to be facilitated by Dr. Craig Smith and Dr. Ivy Higgins. I think we're asking that you put the questions in the chat. Or excuse me, would you like to unmute? Or are we going to connect? Yeah, just unmute. All right. Perhaps through a show of hands, let's see, Dr. Smith. I found it particularly intriguing, Dr. Melson-White. What are the joys and the pains of the labor? Those of us who labor, and the marking and the correction and the suggestions that we offer in marking these scripts, you know, then you get back some scripts that hardly reflect what you have offered by way of suggestion or advice. But happily, you know, there are instances in which this instruction goes a far way to recrafting or assisting students to, you know, revising their original drafts. Is Ivy Higgins on? Can we stop the sharing? Right, here we go.
So do you want me to stop sharing?
Yes, please.
Okay.
So, okay, great. Thank you so much. And perhaps if there are any questions, until Dr. Smith comes, I'm not able to see Professor Higgins. Are you there? And I think I've unmuted everyone. I'm not sure. And Dr. Bailey, if you could assist me here. Are there any questions from members of our audience? Okay.
Beaumont Todd has his hand up.
Okay. Can you go ahead? I think, is everybody unmuted? Dr. Smith, are you on?
Yes, I am. And so I see that Beaumont Todd has his hand up. Let me unmute. Mr. Todd, you can go ahead and unmute.
Okay, now, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay, good night to everybody that's on. My question is regarding now, when it comes to the education of the students, moving forward, you know, as a lecturer, how are we then, when we're looking at language, to focus on what aspect that we're trying to develop? And the reason I'm asking that is, being both a student and a father, I'm a writer and I'm a poet. But my daughter, she has difficulties with her writing, interestingly enough, because she writes how she speaks. She can communicate clearly, no problem. But when it comes down to having to do scholastic writing, it's easier for her to write and communicate, and she communicates beautifully in how she writes because of what she's naturally heard from her environment and what she's learned. But then if she has to take that into an academic setting, she's going to be told what you're saying is wrong. So my question, you know, like I said, as both a student and as a parent, what are we then to promote in ourselves as a Caribbean going forward when it comes to the use of the language, of just looking towards what is accepted academically and scholastically or what actually promotes us as a unique individuals, a part of a Caribbean-based or unified Caribbean.
Do you want to take that, Vivette, please?
Okay, thank you for the question. Up to now, I would say you would need to do all of those things, because the culture of literacy that we currently have promotes a kind of English only situation for our purposes in the English speaking Caribbean. But as a parent and also as poet and all of the other things that you are, you might know the value of the other languages and other language varieties that we have, so that you can in your private space explain to your child all of the benefits of being able to work different language forms, but to be able to understand the importance of context, so that when in the academic setting, she's asked to produce writing that would suggest you should focus on certain limits and write within certain constraints, she would be able to see that as a contextual issue and not necessarily just as the totally political thing that is happening with how we view language in the Caribbean. Because we cannot deny our context, what is happening, what is required outside of an English composition classroom or an academic writing classroom. Many things are happening and many different language varieties are in play, but in certain contexts, in certain settings, in certain situations, we are called upon to demonstrate all the forms that we know we are called upon to flex our language muscle. And in an academic writing classroom, where there still is the aim to have individuals performing in some kind of internationally accepted English, while there might be a Dr. Owen Bring who tries to make the students comfortable by allowing them to use their vernaculars and other language forms, there still is, towards the end of that teaching situation, the intention of ensuring that the curriculum requirements are met.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Owenbring, did you have anything to add?
Oh, perfectly said.
All righty. I see that Sheldon Ramsey has their hand up, but Dr. Barkey has asked a question in the chat. He says, I wonder if each speaker could address how their research applies to virtual environments for teaching. How can these strategies transfer? And after you respond to that, then I will have Sheldon Ramsey ask a question. So Dr. Owenbring, Dr. Milson White.
I'm trying to formulate a smart answer to Dr. Barkey's question.
Okay, would you like me to begin?
Sure.
So one of the interesting things for us is that besides the fact that we needed before last year to be thinking about digital spaces, we are now forced, because of the pandemic, to be making adjustments in virtual spaces. I was working on something about how students, metaphors that students write by. And now I have to be changing that to metaphors students wrote by, because I'm noticing that since last year, nearly everything that students write have to do with the pandemic and with operating in virtual spaces. So the delay in Dr. Owenbring's answer, for example, has to do with the fact that right now we are contemplating how the things that we have examined so far and things that I'm suggesting we still need to be doing will translate now that we are forced to be considering virtual spaces. Certainly, we'll have to be thinking about, when we say to students, jot down your thoughts however they are coming to you. And before this, we would be thinking of them writing down in Bahamian, in dialect, or in Jamaican Creole, or whatever else is used outside of the standard language. We now must be contending with the fact that students are doing quite a bit of writing in virtual spaces. and the writing that they are doing is coming in abbreviated forms, and emoticon has almost taken over the lexicon and so on. So we now have these things to be thinking about when we try to teach in an academic writing or composition classroom, and when we try to teach in a core course classroom. We have to be thinking about how are we going to be trying to pass on to students the lessons that seem necessary in spaces when, for one, they are not attending only to what we are saying, because they're doing a lot of other writing and conversing while we are trying to teach, and they're also not writing in longhand that we would probably require. So we're going to have to be thinking about how we adjust our assignments to students, how we adjust our assessments, and all of these things are just going to be flooding us. But others in the audience might actually have some thoughts in response to my question about how do we deal with emergency situations. Dr. Winbury?
I have one observation, is that since the beginning of the pandemic, the emails from students that I get have kind of merged with WhatsApp messages. There's the there's no longer the formality to emails. There's not even the dear Dr. Owenbring. Yeah.
Okay. I see Sheldon Ramsey. You can unmute and ask your question.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Can everyone hear me? All right,
Yes.
thank you. All right. So I noticed that was a theme throughout two of the speeches or the talks. It was talking about Anglo-Caribbean dialect. I'm sorry, Creole, I might say. And there was a section which spoke on about Bahamian Creole, or like we would commonly call Bahamian dialect. Now, I know from the first talk that the speaker observed about this sort of formality, shunning of like Bahamian Creole, and in the second talk, they talked about in a study in which there was I think it was a first year writing, which I think Jamaican I think the professors allowed them to write out in Jamaican Creole and translate. Now, there was some sort of thing that I've seen was that when it comes to the Bahamian dialect, especially in the Creole in the written form, there haven't been sort of an agreement on like spelling wise. So my sort of question is, if we were to go about and we see more value in sort of Bahamian Creole, how we go about, or what would need to be done in order to teach sort of Bahamian Creole in the classroom?
Great. That's a great question. Yes, obviously in the Anglophone Caribbean, we are behind, say, Haiti, that actually has a couple orthographies, that is codified sets of spelling for their Creole. Jamaica is ahead of us in the Bahamas. They have the so-called Cassidy-LePage orthography, which still hasn't had, just a set of spellings, just, for the words of Jamaican Creole. They've had some pilot programs, but still, Dr. Milson White can correct me, but still hasn't had a lot of traction. Yes, I would think that we would want to build off of the Cassidy-LePage orthography, because they're doing the work there. But in fact, Jamaican Language Unit has an online lecture coming up on February 15th about the Cassidy-LePage orthography, trying to teach people how to spell that way, using that system of spellings. Vivette, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, to say that not having an agreed spelling system right now would not be a hindrance to including a Creole language in teaching, because what's happening in Jamaica right now is that we still use in the main what is called I dialect writing. So as you see it and as you would normally think it should look based
So
on the English you
just
know, you write the word.
so anytime
However,
any of you
some people
go ahead.
call chaka chaka patois, because there are some rules to the Cassidy Lupate system. And as I mentioned with the project that was done, it would have needed time to get the students to learn it, to write their thoughts in it, which would really impede the process in a way. The thing to bear in mind though is that when someone seriously takes up trying to develop a spelling system, it's a matter of deciding, and this is a political act, which area of the country am I going to be using as the standard? Because that's what was done with English. That's what was done with French. A certain area of Paris was taken to be the area that would be used, and what was said there, how things were done, etc. That's what determined what would be written down. But you can start out using a dialect writing if one is going to be including a Creole or any other non-standard language in a teaching situation.
And in the book, in the collection, Dr. Jacob Dyer Spiegel, he actually talks in depth about his experience doing something like that. I wouldn't call it, it wasn't a pilot project, formalized, doing something like that in the Bahamas, at UB.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Dr. Tony Francis.
Dr. Tony Francis in the house.
That's right. So wonderful to be here. And I am very proud to be attending the 15th Anatole Rogers Memorial Lecture. It's always a night that is dear to my heart on the Bahamian social calendar, and I'm glad to be a part of it. I have a few things that I want to do, but firstly, I do want to piggyback on the conversation we've just had and connect this idea of codifying a regional language to the history of the English language, not only the codification of English with the first dictionary, but also if we look at the American canon, the codification of Harvard English as the sort of English. This is part of the tradition of the English teaching of English and the teaching of composition is to sort of determine one class-based, politicized version of English as the English, right? And then to dictate what is considered correct, smart, intelligent, authoritative based on that mandate. And I think it's fascinating that Jamaica is questioning and contending with this idea of codifying, and even the Bahamas should question this idea of codifying, because the Bahamas has a variety of Englishes, all of which allow for an opportunity to exercise one's voice. And this is really the key here, is how do we get our students at COB, and I still feel like it's ours and that I am a part of it because I love this institution. How do we get our students to exercise their voice in ways that give them agency and power, and that give them an opportunity to contribute to the discourses that determine what constitutes their lives? So I find myself at one time wanting very much to defend my my argument for rigor in academic writing at the College of Bahamas, because that's where we began, and of course that was my language, is rigor. But in rigor, we often will pay attention to the words on the page, but we're also paying attention to the ideas and the ways in which we can get students to express their ideas well and to garner an audience. Okay, but here's the question that's more important here. I think that we are in a position here with our remote learning, our use of multimodal forms to learn, to interact with each other on a college level, we have to use multimodal forms. And I want to ask you, what does the introduction of new media, the insistence now, not only the introduction that we've been doing in composition over time, but the reality of the insistence of new media forms for communicating ideas, for communicating information. How does multimodal and new media forms of composition undercut our traditional modes of, or our traditional notions of what is good English and how do we communicate best, right? We're teaching students to write and to communicate now, understanding the reality of new media and multimodal media. And the reality is the way that we get our truths, our voice, our information out right now is electronic, it's multimedia. We're connecting to various audiences, including academic. And how does that determine how we teach composition and what kind of writing is important for which audiences? And how do we make the realities of the global audience important to our teaching of composition in our new normal?
I smell a article for you, Dr. Francis. Or maybe a book.
Oh my, it's time for that.
Vivette, do you want to tackle that, please?
So I was about to say that I think that she has a partial answer to the question. One of the challenges for me has to do with the terms that we use for our work. And sometimes writing seems insufficient for me. Sometimes composition works better because we are teaching students to engage with their thoughts, engage with idea generation, and with communication of ideas. And traditionally, we've had students doing the communication in text-based forms. But what is happening today is that we are getting back to some of the older forms of communication. We are talking about new media and so on. But remember that our forebears, the Aztecs and the Mayas and many others, used to communicate using other symbols than the ones we use today in terms of text-based writing. And we are going back to some of those forms where we're using the emoticons, for example, the shortened words, the text language, and so on. So that one of the things we need to consider now, and perhaps you'll think about in that paper or book that you're going to be producing, is, for one, do we do some kind of reconsideration of the terms that we're using for our work? And two, how do we go about helping people to make the distinction between things that I suggested we're conflating: language, English, writing, writing in a first language versus writing in a second language, and so on. And then now, as opposed to composing, where it's not only writing that is involved, but is throwing in an image here, putting in a little video clip there, and so on, to present ideas that I'm trying to communicate. So in a way, we're moving into a new space, it would appear, but we're also going back to some older ways of communicating. And people from the East, people in Asia, India, and some of those places don't see what is happening in new media now as something totally new, because they can relate to their forebears doing that kind of communication, that kind of composing of ideas.
And these are great questions. And what I want is all of my wonderful bright UB students to go off and get a PhD under Dr. Milson White and come back and work at UB. Anyway.
All right, thank you. We have a couple of questions here that came in, and I'll read them off. We have two questions, one from Ide Thompson and one from Wendy McLean Cook. And so Mr. Thompson's question is, how could the language use of Creole in the study at UWI be curated for use in other Caribbean school settings, such as primary schools in the Bahamas? And Ms. Cook asks, how do we prepare instructors to address language identity issues, even as they teach composition or academic in Caribbean classrooms? Composition, academic English, I guess, in Caribbean classrooms.
I'll take the first one, curated. I'm not sure how fast we'll get there. In the 1950s, the United Nations indicated the value of instructing people in their first language. And you see where we are up to today in nearly all of the Caribbean. It's only the Haitians and some of the Dutch peoples who are, who have taken that on in any serious way. But I really do hope that when we get the full presentation of findings of that study, that it will add traction to what other individuals like Hubert Devonish have done. Devonish had done a bilingual project as well in primary schools, and they seem to have got good results, but there is still quite a task trying to convince policymakers to seriously take on the business of bilingual teaching or biliterate education. And in the Bahamas, right there, some individuals, as Dr. Enbring said, there have been some attempts to include Bahamian dialect to allow students to develop a certain amount of comfort, before the class progresses. So it will still take some time before we reach the point of curating.
Right, it's fundamentally a political issue, and it needs to be driven by the Ministry of Education. Yeah, we are a small part of the equation at UB. I want some, yeah, that's all I want to say.
All right, do we want to attempt the second question? How do we prepare instructors?
Just to add a little bit to the first one, so I'm saying we really need more people getting on board and taking up these subjects in their research and writing. The more voices that we have adding to the conversations, the more we can bring to bear the points on our policymakers and so on. In terms of training, it seems to me that perhaps there is need for a little bit of retraining of people who teach English, who teach composition or academic writing, communication, and such subjects in the Caribbean. In terms of, for one, there is probably need for a little bit more engagement with linguistics on one hand, and on the other hand, we need a little bit more sensitizing in terms of the political dimensions of language teaching. I have found that we tend to ignore that a lot in the Caribbean. We just go ahead doing perhaps what we're told to do without realizing how politically charged is the act of teaching, writing in any language, in any institution.
Yes, to tackle the second question, I would say, well, I am a member of a fledgling organization. A few people are here tonight are from it. It's called CATALP, the Caribbean Association of Tertiary Level Academic Literacies Practitioners. That organization is aiming to put on workshops for instructors to talk about a variety of issues. So we're aiming to hopefully have at least 1 or 2 Zoom workshops coming down the line in the next year, hopefully. Yeah.
All righty, thank you. So we have.
Excuse me, I don't know if you see Dr. Deaker's hand, Dr. Smith.
Oh, I did
you.
not. But yes, go ahead,
No
Dr.
worries. No worries. Thank you for a very thought-provoking talk. One of the most intriguing things for me in what you both said was the question and the problem of equity and access. And especially in this pandemic times, I think those questions become even more pertinent. So I'm wondering, as we are talking about these remote teachings that we are forced into, and which is the now new norm, as you say, how those questions of access and equity sort of connect and mesh with questions of information access, but also understanding and information on sort of perception. So if you have any strategies, or you could talk a little bit about that point, that would be very interesting.
Vivette?
I thought you would start off with that one, Raymond. One of the realities that we have to face in many Caribbean countries is that the students who seem to be most removed from academic engagements are students who might also be from linguistic backgrounds where they're also removed from the language of instruction. So there are those connections that I imagine our political leaders need to contemplate, because there is the desire to educate more Caribbean peoples. But the reality is that more individuals who should get access to higher education in a time like this are individuals who are multiply removed from the centers of power, and they are removed linguistically as well as economically. And so the challenge for us as we happen to get them into classroom spaces is to find ways to help students to be comfortable in our classrooms, but also for us to help them to see the possibilities that are there for them to move closer to the centers of power in each of our countries. The task, it might seem like a huge one, but the most we can do, as Nettleford says, is keep hoping even in the face of despair, and we keep trying.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up. We're coming up on the 2-hour mark. And so we will finish with one quick question, one quick response, I'm sure. So Beaumont Todd asks, has research addressed the difficulties that arise in the use of language due to the emotional blocks that develop when students are traumatized with not being able to grasp a particular manner of speaking and writing? Psychologically, these blocks also affect a student's ability to learn and to want to learn, because they naturally will think in and write the language they find the least resistance initially.
Has that type of research been done? Yes, but not really in the Caribbean, right, Vivette? Yes?
Not really in the Caribbean, but we know that that kind of research has been done since, well, from before UNESCO gave its pronouncement. So from way down in the 20th.
But yes, Mr. Todd does phrase the question in a nice way, for sure. hits it on the head for sure.
I imagine the point though is that there still remains the situation that many students at various educational levels are not at ease with the language of instruction. And I guess the question is, are we taking into consideration the psychological challenges, the trauma, and so on for students? The book Creole composition that we've been talking about addresses this to some extent with various individuals talking about cases of trauma, but also there are contributors who have indicated things that they have done to attempt to make students feel at ease in the educational space. But again, I'm saying, I'm throwing out the call for more of us to take on some of these questions, to redo some of these studies, to do them in our new dispensation and produce the findings to help with making a case to our policymakers and sometimes just the leaders in our institutions so that we can do more right by students.
Okay, so I think that we will give the presenters a minute each to wrap up. I know Dr. Milton White has just almost probably wrapped up, but I just give her another minute to any final thoughts, a minute for her and then for Dr. Owenbring, and then we will turn it over to Dr. Bailey. Any final thoughts?
Go ahead, Raymond.
Great. Just as I've been saying, we are really just part of the start of this, hopefully. We really need young Bahamian and Caribbean students to tackle this issue, to push it forward. Yes, and hopefully when y'all go off to get PhDs under Dr. Milton White at UE, you can come back and you can have your cubicle next to mine. It's at UB.
Okay, I'll wrap up by saying more of us should get involved with doing research with regard to academic writing, advanced written literacy in the Caribbean, to help with bringing about some changes in what we do, but also to establish our work and to bring some recognition to the writing program work that we are doing. There are some things that we have little control over because of what happens in the lower levels of education, but we can still, wherever we find ourselves, in whichever kind of institution, in whichever country, do some things to bring about more awareness regarding language, regarding writing, regarding why some of the strategies that we use are not working. We're asking students to make huge shifts when we ask them to write in English, for example, when they have challenges with distinguishing between English and the other language varieties that they use. When we ask them to generate really good content in English, when for students from societies that are largely oral, using language is not about making sure that what you say is accurate, but is about, you know, getting a kind of feel-good quality and so on. And we also have to bring some awareness to how the writing that we're asking students to do, whether in composition or academic writing classrooms or in the core courses, are now going to be influenced by the demands of the virtual spaces in which we are operating. Or if we just go back to normal classroom teaching, what kinds of shifts would we be making given the experience from 2020 into this year, hopefully only into this year.
All right, thank you both. And we will now pass over to Dr. Peter Bailey. But before we do, one of the things one takeaway that we do know that I'm excited about is that there'll be a book project coming out from Dr. Tony Francis, another former UB professor. And so that is going to be very exciting, and maybe that could be another collaborative endeavor between you all as a follow-up to this book. Dr. Bailey?
I'm ready.
Evening, everyone. Come to bring thanks to a lot of people. So much gratitude to the Rogers family, sponsors of ARML, Dr. Jonathan Rogers and his wife, Mrs. Patty Rogers, Dr. Patricia Rogers and Ms. Emily Rogers. The unstinting generosity and commitment of the Rogers family over 15 years has ensured that English studies could continue to promote the humanities through the Anatole Rogers Memorial Lecture. And we're quite happy about that. Thanks to our speakers tonight, Dr. Raymond Owenbring and Dr. Vivette Milson-White, whose insights into language and writing pedagogy tonight were truly illuminating. Thanks to Dr. Mayuri Dika, Chair of English Studies, for her welcome and support of this event. And thank you to Dr. Douglas Barkey, Dean of Fine and Liberal Arts, Faculty of Liberal and Fine Arts, for his remarks and enthusiastic support of this event. Thanks to Ms. Astronique Bowe, Acting Director of Communications in the Office of University Relations, and her team for their promotional work, efficiency, and professionalism. Thanks to Mrs. Sophia Ferguson-Roll and Mrs. Ziet Kulma for their customary reliability and administrative assistance. Thanks to you, the audience. We had, I think 150 people here tonight. And your commitment to this event year after year is truly heartening. And finally, thanks to the ARML committee, who are proud to help bring this signature event into a new format, right? With greater reach during these unusual times. It suggests that maybe we could continue doing that. And that's it from me.
And yeah, I would just like to add thanks to international persons, non-Bahamians, who joined the audience for this presentation. Thank you very much for your presence and for your support of this event. And just generally, thanks to our faithful and dedicated members of the audience who come every year, and to our students who stay the course, for the entire period. That is remarkable. And have a good evening all. We look forward to next year, when hopefully we'll have it in the face-to-face modality, so that we can have the fellowshipping and this discussion and the extended discourse, hopefully in the fall. All right, thank you very much and have a good night.
Wonderful evening. Thank you, everyone. And
Hi, Tony.
The
Nice to
Rogers
see you.
family. And to the COB family. I love you all.
UB, get it right. Get it right.
UB, I'm sorry.
UB.
Greg threw you under the bus a couple
UB?
times tonight.
Try. I don't know. Say, UB, baby.
Good night, all.
Good night, all.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Nice
Yuri.
to see you.